March 9, 1945, Tokyo. A Japanese pilot named Sachio Endo climbs into his cockpit for what he believes will be a routine intercept mission. Within the hour, he'll make a discovery that explains why hundreds of his fellow pilots never returned home. But by the time he figures it out, the sky is already on fire, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop what's coming. For months, Japanese fighter pilots had been living a nightmare that defied everything they knew about aerial combat. The Americans had unleashed something new over the Japanese mainland, the B-29 Superfortress, and it was breaking all the rules. Imagine being a fighter pilot trained to attack bombers at medium altitude where your aircraft performs best. You've done this dozens of times. You know the playbook. Climb to 20,000 feet, close and fast, aim for the engines or cockpit. Get out before the defensive guns tear you apart. But then the B-29s arrive. You push your throttle forward. Your aircraft, whether it's a Zero, a Raiden, or a Shoki, strains against the thin air. You're at 25,000 feet now. Your engine is gasping. The controls feel mushy. Every maneuver takes twice the effort. And above you, impossibly high, the B-29s cruise at 30,000 feet like they own the sky. You try to climb higher. Your aircraft shudders. The engine temperature spikes. You're fighting just to maintain altitude while those massive bombers glide serenely overhead, completely untouchable. But here's what made it truly maddening. Even when you did manage to reach them, even when everything went perfectly and you got close enough to fire, the B-29 would simply leave. It would accelerate. A bomber, accelerating away from a fighter. Pilots returned to base, pale and shaken, trying to explain what they'd witnessed. Some were accused of cowardice. Others were simply not believed. How could a four-engine bomber outrun a fighter designed for speed? By early 1945, the Japanese High Command knew they had a serious problem. B-29s were appearing over Japanese cities with increasing frequency, and the kill rate was abysmal. For every B-29 shot down, Japan was losing dozens of fighters and irreplaceable pilots. Something was protecting those bombers. But what? On the evening of March 9th, radar stations across the Japanese coast began picking up a massive formation heading toward Tokyo. This time, something was different. The B-29s weren't flying at 30,000 feet. They were coming in low, some as low as 5,000 feet. For the Japanese defenders, this seemed like a gift. Finally, the Americans had made a mistake. At this altitude, every fighter in the arsenal could reach them. The guns would be accurate. The chase wouldn't be a desperate climb into oxygen-starved heights. Sachio Endo received the scramble order at 10:47 p.m. As he lifted off into the darkness, he felt something he hadn't felt in months: confidence. But as he climbed through 3,000 feet, he noticed something odd. The air was warm, unusually warm for March, and there was a strange glow on the horizon over Tokyo. By the time he reached 7,000 feet and got his first visual on the B-29 formation, he understood why they were flying low. They weren't carrying conventional bombs. The lead aircraft had already made their drops, and below them, Tokyo wasn't just burning, it was transforming into a vision of hell itself. Incendiary clusters were creating fires so intense they were generating their own weather. Updrafts of superheated air screamed upward at 70 miles per hour, carrying embers and smoke into a churning column that rose thousands of feet. And here's what Endo realized in that moment. The B-29s weren't flying low because they were vulnerable. They were flying low because they were delivering a weapon that required them to get under the jet stream, to place their incendiaries with precision, to turn Tokyo's wooden buildings into kindling. He pushed forward, closing the distance to the nearest B-29. At 500 yards, he could see it clearly, a massive silver shape cutting through the smoke-filled sky. He armed his cannons, but then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The bomber's tailgun turret was tracking him. Not manually, not with the slight delays and overcorrections of a human gunner, but with mechanical precision, smooth, instant, perfectly calibrated. He broke left. The turret followed, anticipating his movement. Endo had encountered fire control systems before, but this was different. This was coordinated. As he maneuvered, trying to find an attack angle, he watched 3 different gun turrets on the B-29 move in concert, covering every approach vector. He'd stumbled onto the B-29's secret weapon, the Central Fire Control System. While Japanese bombers and most Allied bombers relied on individual gunners manually aiming their weapons, the B-29 used an analog computer that networked all defensive positions together. One gunner could control multiple turrets simultaneously. The system calculated lead, deflection, and range automatically, compensating for the bomber's speed, the target's speed, and even air density at altitude. It meant that a B-29 didn't have defensive blind spots like other bombers. Every approach was covered. Every angle was defended. The aircraft could create overlapping fields of fire that turned the space around it into a kill zone. But that wasn't all Endo discovered that night. As he made a high-side pass, trying to dive through the formation quickly, he watched tracers from the B-29's guns arc toward him, and they were on target far faster than should have been possible. The turrets used remote control. The gunners sat inside pressurized compartments, operating their weapons through periscope sights while the system handled the actual aiming. This meant no wind blast, no cold, no hypoxia. The gunners were comfortable, focused, and deadly accurate even at 30,000 feet where Japanese pilots were barely conscious. Endo finally understood why so many pilots never came home. It wasn't just that the B-29 flew higher and faster, though it did both. It wasn't just the armor or the size, though those helped. It was that Boeing had created a bomber that thought faster than the humans trying to kill it. An aircraft that turned the defensive task over to machines, freeing the crew to focus on their mission, while analog computers did the work of staying alive. He broke off his attack and dove away, his aircraft shuddering as he pushed past redline airspeed. By dawn on March 10th, over 100,000 people were dead in Tokyo. 16 square miles of the city had been reduced to ash. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history, more deadly than the atomic bombs that would fall 5 months later. Sachio Endo survived the night. He would write in his journal about what he'd learned, about the impossible technology the Americans had deployed, about the systematic way the B-29 had neutralized every advantage Japanese fighters once held. But his discoveries would never reach the engineers or commanders who might have done something with the information. By March 1945, Japan's industrial capacity was shattered. There was no time to redesign aircraft, no resources to develop countermeasures, no fuel to properly train new pilots, even if better tactics existed. The B-29 raids would continue, night after night, city after city, until Japan's urban centers were burning ruins. In the end, that's the tragedy of Endo's discovery. He figured out why the B-29 was untouchable, why it represented a quantum leap in aviation technology that Japan simply couldn't match. He learned that America had industrialized air warfare in a way that turned bombers into fortress cities in the sky, defended by machines that never tired, never panicked, and never missed. But he'd learned it far too late to matter. The B-29 Superfortress represents one of those rare moments in military history where technology creates an insurmountable advantage. It wasn't just a better bomber, it was a fundamentally different kind of weapon, designed with systems integration that wouldn't become standard in aviation for another decade. Japanese pilots like Sachio Endo were brave, skilled, and determined. But they were fighting an enemy that had already won the technological war. An enemy that had turned the sky itself into an unassailable fortress. March 9th, 1945 was the night one pilot finally understood the terrible mathematics of that advantage. It was also the night Tokyo learned what modern warfare truly meant. By the time the sun rose, the age of the Superfortress had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. If you found this story fascinating, check out our video on the one Japanese aircraft that could actually reach the B-29s and why it still wasn't enough. Thanks for watching.